presenting a 3-day residency at King's Place focusing on Thomas Arne. This year is the 300th anniversary of his birth, and he was the greatest English composer during his lifetime and is really nowadays only known for Rule Britannia. Arne was born in Covent Garden and died in Covent Garden and spent most of his career writing music and rehearsing and performing in Covent Garden. So in fact he spent most of his life within the same square mile.
I'm standing here in the house where Handel lived, which is now the Handel House Museum. Arne did not live in the fashionable area where Handel lived, but lived in Covent Garden. Handel's presence very much overshadowed some brilliant musicians who were working in London at the same time. The wonderful composer Maurice Green, the composer of quite well-known symphonies, as well as many other works of William Boyce, and above all, Thomas Arne.
Arne was probably the greatest English composer of his time, but then he was contemporary with Handel, who was the greatest composer internationally of his time. So in a way it's almost as if Arne is the sort of Tim Henman to Handel's Roger Federer. there's a sense that with all these English composers they had a little bit of a chip on their shoulder that all these foreigners were coming over and getting all the big jobs.
Thomas Arne didn't work in quite the same circles as the rest of them because he was a Roman Catholic. And so couldn't become a cathedral organist, couldn't go up some of the more established paths of a composer. And anyway, being a Roman Catholic, with the Jacobite threat going on in the first part of the 18th century, was always a slightly difficult position to have. Whereas Handel moved around the courts of kings and wrote large-scale works for the aristocracy. In some ways, Arne is more closely associated, not so much with the aristocracy, but with the theatre-going public. And also, many of his works were inspired by some of the political crises of the first part of the 18th century. He'd written a very patriotic piece called Alfred, of which the most famous number is Rule Britannia. But if you look at the words of Rule Britannia, and you relate it up to the 1730s, the political crises, the growing empire, the expansion of Britain in as far as the East Indies, Britain never, never shall be slaves, Britain rules the waves, all of these in a sense speak less to our own age than they did to the early 18th century. And it is unfortunate that the only bit of this wonderful piece, Alfred the Mask, that has survived to the present day is Rule Britannia, especially in massive versions as used at the last night of the proms, which are so unlike the way Arne would have envisaged it as to be the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole. Nowadays, Rule Britannia, for most people, its picture is of a stout singer emerging onto the stage with an audience of anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000, beating their British hearts, waving their Union Jacks, screaming, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves," in an orchestration inflated like an elephant from a mouse, in order, as it were, to beat the necessary patriotic drum.
During the latter part of Arne's career, he became involved in the ballad opera that became a quintessential English style with very, very short musical numbers. The Beggar's Opera was a fundamental part of developing this style.
John Gay is, of course, famous for being the librettist of the Beggar's Opera. What made the Beggar's Opera so popular is the tunes were much more demotic. They came from the people. Well, they came from more popular circulation. Arne and other composers, his contemporaries like William Boyce and Maurice Green, were quite concerned to set a distance between the Italianate German style that Handel brought and their own English style. In particular, what they liked was a rather more sort of gallant and easygoing melodic style, of which the master was Arne. Arne was probably more gifted than any of his contemporaries, other than Handel, at a new style of melodic writing. They aren't the only ones who wanted a kind of Englishness to go through.
Alfred was commissioned for the Prince of Wales, who had set himself up in opposition to his father, the King, George II. The Masque was premiered in Clifton in 1740 and in fact wasn't then performed in London until 1745. Arne spent most of his career chipping away at Alfred and trying to find different ways of making it work. So it was revived numerous times during his lifetime, and each time it was revived, he would make modifications both to the plot and the text, and indeed to the music. The story of Alfred is incredibly brief. Britain had been conquered by the Danes and Alfred had gone into hiding. He's reunited with his wife and his son, Edward, and they hide out while the Danes rampage the country. Then they suddenly receive news that 1,200 Britons have assembled an army together to defend Alfred, and Alfred returns to conquer the Danes, and the peace ends in triumph with the Danes banished and rule Britannia proclaimed out loud. In terms of its structure, I think it certainly has flaws. It strikes me as being quite interesting that the first half of the piece has a lot of slow music and very little fast, dynamic music, whereas the second half has a lot more virtuosic writing and a lot more energy. And in a sense, this does reflect the gloom and defeatism of the opening half of the piece, and then when the positivity of the possibility of conquering the invading Danes becomes prevalent, the music has an upturn in its levels of energy. There is a sort of folksy brevity and catchiness, the sort of music that might be hummed in the street. The melodic charm and lyricism is definitely there, but the units of the phrase lengths tend to be shorter. In between the two performances of Alfred, we're presenting an insight evening focusing on Artaxerxes, which I think is the greatest of Arne's surviving works. We presented a production at the Royal Opera House last autumn, which proved very successful and popular. And we've also made a studio recording, which is due for release soon on Nin Records. When we performed Artaxerxes last year at the Royal Opera House, it was very heartening to see how popular it was with the audiences, and the feedback was phenomenal. And I think it really shows that there is a strong public taste to explore these areas of the repertoire, and I think Arne in particular has a real following and a real interest. I think Artaxerxes and Alfred represent the more serious end of Arne's compositional output, and we can't know what his own views of his work were, but I think these two works really represent the higher sort of artistic craft of his output. The nucleus of the music is driven by a lyricism and a melodic invention that for me placed him above his English peers.
Probably what we should really remember Arne most for as being the most prominent contributor to the English theatre and its music in the early part of the 18th century.